Would Jesus have really said, "Make America great again"? Like, is that something that he would have said? Make America great again. Take back the nation. Is that something that he would have said? Is the sentiment, would Jesus have agreed with the sentiment of making America great again? That's kind of the topic for this table flipper, and this is perhaps my most impulsive one yet, since the very first one, honestly. I was watching an episode of Southside Rabbi, their conversation with the Christian rap artist Flame, and they had a quote, and it basically stirred kind of this whole video out of me. But what they said was that nostalgia, or they were quoting another author, I think, but they were saying that nostalgia sometimes can be the recollection of history without the necessary shame or guilt that should be attached to that history. Before someone gets all upset and saying, "Why would you attach guilt and shame to history?" There are things in history that ought to be shamed and that people ought to feel guilt for. I don't think anyone questions that. I think just the debate is what things should be shamed versus what things ought to be, remembered gloriously. I had some scripture that I wanted to get into before looking through a couple of historical examples in America from the last century. The first place I wanted to read out of was from the wisdom literature, right? Like the biblical literature for how to kind of be wise, in a godly way in this broken world, right? And so looking in the 6th chapter of Ecclesiastes, we get this wisdom, right? Because that's really what it is. Not so much instruction as it is just wisdom. Ecclesiastes chapter 6, verse 10. Quote, say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Don't ask, why were the good old days good? You're not asking that out of wisdom. Because a lot of times we can feel like we're asking that question out of wisdom, like, oh, the good old days, why were the former days better than these? It's not from wisdom that you're saying that, right? Because chances are you're not actually measuring those former days against the Word of God to see if those former days were actually objectively good in God's sight. You're measuring the former days against your subjective definitions of good and evil. You're measuring the former days against essentially your preferences for what you like, right? Like, that's usually what's happening when we're asking that question, what happened to the good old days? Right? Because if we're taking a biblical view of things, we haven't had good old days since Eden. Like, this planet has not seen good former days unless you want to go all the way back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Right? After the 2nd chapter, it's all downhill from there. It's just, what flavor of downhill was it? Right? And I wanted to show, one example from the Old Testament and one example from the New Testament of people asking, why were the former days better than these, but not out of a heart of wisdom. out of a heart of folly, out of a heart of foolishness and short-sightedness, honestly. A heart that's using your subjective measures of good and evil instead of relying on God's objective standards of good. Objective standards of good and love for him as God and for your fellow man. You're just asking, dang, those days were better for me. Where'd those days that were better for me go? So from the Old Testament, I wanted to look at, and our pastor at the Vine literally just we just had this conversation like Wednesday night, with the congregants, with the congregation. Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse. I'm gonna read verse 3. I'm gonna put verse 3 on the screen. But context, right? Like, this is just after the people were miraculously saved from slavery in Egypt, right? Saved from slavery in Egypt, and they're en route. They're en route to the promised land via this wilderness path, right? And this is what they say, right? I'll start reading in verse 2, but I'll put 3 on the screen. Starting in verse 2, and the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord, in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. To kill the whole assembly with hunger. Now, I'm just repeating what what my pastor was talking about. But his point was, you guys were slaves in Egypt. Nope. Didn't have human rights, weren't treated well, right? The Bible tells us that, right? Once a Pharaoh arose that didn't remember Joseph, right? Like he starts treating the descendants of Israel like trash for 4 centuries. 4 centuries enslaved. And right after being set free, on their way to the promised land, they say that they would have rather died by God's hand in the land of Egypt, because apparently, according to their recollection, they were sitting by meat pots and were eating bread to the full. But when you actually go back to the book of Exodus and read about what was going down, that's not true at all. They weren't just sitting lazily by on the sidelines, having filet mignon, over some amazing bread, right? Like, they were being worked to death. They're being worked to death around Egypt, right? But for whatever reason, that nostalgia gets in there, right? Like, they're looking, first off, they're short-sighted. So one, they're short-sighted, right? They think that they're only focusing on their immediate circumstances. Wow, being in the wilderness is kind of tough, right? But they're only looking at it right there. They're not looking at it in the context of the story as they knew it, right? Like, sure, they didn't have the whole revelation of Scripture, but what they knew was that they were slaves and that God was saving them, and that God told them, I'm taking you to a land that's going to produce plentifully for you. And it's not going to take you that long to get there. The journey should have taken 2 weeks tops. 2 weeks going slow. Like, not long at all. And if your people were enslaved for 400 years, and God miraculously frees you and then tells you, hey, there's a free land that's about a 14-day walk that way, are you complaining? Like they did. Because they were so focused on being, perfectly content all the time that they missed out on the greater context of what was going on. Right? And I think when I think that sometimes you know, when Christian conservatives talk about, some of the old heads of Christian conservatives talk about, you know, the previous generations of America, they have a tendency to speak like the Israelites here, right? Like, oh man, like things were so much better, back in my day. We didn't have transgender bathrooms, and we didn't have this like cisgender, divide and all sorts of stuff. And, I'm just sitting there like, okay, fair, but what was going on in your day? Like, like if you guys had done such a good job like evangelizing and discipling the world, why are we even still here? Why are we even still here? And then the danger that happens that, I as a church elder and, you know, I as a church elder and, you know, the pastoral staff at the Vine have been, we've been combating is, you know, like our generation and down, because I'm 25, 25 years old and down. Like a lot of these cats end up being told by like the parental generation that basically America was like a fairy tale land in their day, and it's only with this new younger generation where the world got sinful again. No nuance is ever brought up. Like we talk about the outcomes of situations, but not the things that caused it, right? And, we just look at history through a foolishly nostalgic lens. And so that was the wisdom literature, that was the Old Testament, now for the New Testament, right? And where else would I be quoting but out of my boy Luke? And our Luke's and the Luke Bible study on this channel is not, we're not in chapter 11 yet. We just got into chapter 7. So it's going to be, some weeks, maybe a couple of months before we get to 11. But just looking here in Luke chapter 11, verse 47, verse 47 and 48. Right? And I guess you could say 49. But Jesus is right in the middle of, perhaps the most important block of teaching that Luke has to offer us, when he's, lambasting the Pharisees and the scribes. And one of the things that he says to them is very interesting. Starting in verse 47, Jesus, in the middle of speaking, says, "Woe to you! For you build the tombs of the prophets whom your fathers killed." Think about that. The Pharisees build the tombs of the prophets of old. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the old prophets, and any other prophets that weren't named in the Bible but, preached the same message, right? They built their tombs, but it was their fathers that killed them. Right? And not just in the sense of ancestry, right? But like you go back and read the prophetic writings of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and the people that opposed Jeremiah and Ezekiel in their day were like spitting image replicas of the Pharisees of Jesus's day. And that's what Jesus was getting at. That's what Jesus was getting at with these guys. Right? Like you build, let me just kind of translate this for modern day America, right? You build monuments for, you build monuments for civil rights leaders like MLK, like Rosa Parks. You build monuments to these people, but by your refusal to push the ball of racial equality forward in your own generation, you show that you actually are in agreement not with the Rosa Parks or the MLK, but with the people that oppose them in their day. Because you, in your current generation, are opposing the people that are saying the very same things that they said one generation ago. But you want to act like you actually support them. So you are witnesses, and you consent to the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you built their tombs. Right? So, what does Jesus say God's going to do in response to this hypocrisy? Right? Verse 49, therefore also the wisdom of God said. Now, if that's confusing for you, it's because I'm not gonna exegete it fully here. Just wait for when we get there in Luke. Suffice it to say here that in the wisdom literature and in Proverbs especially, definitely Proverbs, like check Proverbs chapters 8 and 9. Just go read them, right? The wisdom of God isn't just a concept. It's fleshed out as like a character that was there with God in the beginning when he created all things, right? The wisdom of God was with God in the beginning during creation. That's our King, Jesus, right? Back to verse 49, this is God's response. Therefore also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they'll kill and persecute. Some of whom they'll kill and persecute. And he goes on to say more stuff, but I want to focus on that, right? What's God's plan? Well, how does God answer their hypocrisy? He's going to send them apostles and prophets, which does get fulfilled in the book of Acts, right? The apostles and, New Testament prophets are sent out, and the Pharisees reject them too, right? And it's like you see what God's going to do, right? Like, okay, you claim to support true righteousness. All right, then I'll send true righteousness your way, and we'll see how you respond. Will you bend the knee to true righteousness, or will you cling to your foolish nostalgia of how things used to be, and in clinging to your definition of what was good back then, you're going to end up, for all practical purposes, snuffing out the life of the Son of God on display in your generation. All right? And if you think I'm exaggerating, it's time to, kind of transfer things over, I guess, to, to the Board of Wisdom, where we can look back over. I picked out 3 or 4 different things to look at throughout the last, 50 to 100 years of American history. Well, it's 2021 now, so maybe the last 120 years of American history. And we'll just ask the question, like, should we look back on those days where things like what we're about to read were happening and say these were good days that we should long to return to? You be the judge, but, for now, transfer over to the board. All right, here we are, Board of Wisdom, ready to go. Whoops, don't want to show too much of that. Let's see. All right, so let me see. Okay, I stuck with 3. All right, so 3 stories, situations, whatever, from American history. And, let's just be honest, man, and ask the question, should we look back on history where these sorts of things were normative, as if they were good days? And maybe even ask the next question, right? The question that would actually be loving to your neighbor, and ask the question, should all of my neighbors look at these historical events as if they're good, right? So short little article from the Washington Post, title, The Lynching That Black Chattanooga Never Forgot Takes Center Stage Downtown. All right, so I'll read and chop it up with these 3 articles, right? On a recent warm winter afternoon, hundreds of Chattanoogans flocked downtown to stroll along the Walnut Street Bridge, a picturesque walking path that towers over the Tennessee River. And I guess that would be the bridge. Once a decrepit eyesore, today the refurbished bridge is a jewel of modern Chattanooga and a symbol of progress for the city that's undergone an urban renaissance. As part of a years-long effort to transform Chattanooga into an outdoor destination, the bridge is now a popular backdrop for marriage proposals, festivals, and summer fireworks. Pictures of its bright blue beams appear on the city's tourism websites and brochures. There's a rock-climbing wall on one of the bridge's pillars. "That's our Eiffel Tower," said Match Patel, a businessman who owns a hotel at the southern entrance of the bridge. But for many of Chattanooga's black residents, the city's beloved pedestrian bridge is not an architectural beacon of the New South, but a painful reminder of the old. Before the Walnut Street Bridge became a tourist draw, it was a lynching ground. In 1893 and again in 1906, enraged white mobs hanged black men from the bridge. Quote, "A lot of these people don't know what happened on that bridge. In the white community, it wasn't spoken out in the open so much," said Eric Atkins, a local activist who's worked to raise awareness of the killings and memorialize the victims. In the black community, you never forget one of these atrocities. You never forget a lynching. And might I suggest the reason that you never forget a lynching is because it's murder, but also because trauma and, racial trauma like that, like it sticks to you, man. And maybe I should broaden it to not just say racial trauma, right? But any trauma that happens to you as a result of another human being devaluing the image of God on you will leave marks, right? Because as I've said before, the image of God on people generates a value that demands certain rights. Like, this man should not be murdered, should not be lynched. Right? Even as the bridge became a central gathering place of the city, some black Chattanoogans who know its history have refused to cross it. You refuse to cross it. And looking at the caption of this picture here, Donovan Brown, a speaker, organizer, and equity trainer, stands near the entrance to the Walnut Street Bridge, where Ed Johnson, a black man wrongfully accused of raping a white woman, was lynched in 1906. "I really don't feel comfortable walking the bridge," said Donovan Brown. "I felt as if by walking across the bridge that it was some sort of affirmation of silence, or the fact that it's a playground now." So, let me ask, do we want to go back to those days? Like when we say these phrases like "Make America Great Again," do we really think them through? Or if we do think them through, are we thinking them through from a rather shallow perspective? And even more importantly, are we measuring that statement against the canon, against God's word? Does that statement and do the intentions of my heart that cause me to say that statement, do they match up with God's definition of good, of loving my neighbor, of justice? Do they? If the answer is no, then why is it that there's something in you that craves to return to those days? If you didn't know, you didn't know, and that just gets fixed with knowledge. But really ask yourself that question, man. Really ask it. At a time when Americans are reconsidering what is worthy of public memorialization and removing statues across the country that commemorate those who fought to uphold systems of oppression against black people, Chattanooga is aiming to identify new heroes to venerate, right? And why is this important? Why is this important, right? Because the heroes that a culture venerates speak volumes about the sorts of stories that they want to play out in their lives. They speak volumes. The memorial, designed by artist Jerome Meadows, will mark the location where Ed Johnson, a black man wrongfully accused of raping a white woman, was killed in 1906. Johnson had been convicted in a county court and sentenced to death. The lynching occurred after the U.S. Supreme Court ordered a stay of execution. Johnson's tragic end led to the first and only criminal trial in Supreme Court's history and affirmed its power to intervene in state and local affairs. In 2000, a Hamilton County judge formally cleared Johnson of wrongdoing. Killed in 1906, accused of raping the woman at that time, right around the turn of the year 1900, and it takes until the year 2000 to clear his name. Right? The heroes that we venerate speak volumes about the stories that we want to play out in our lives, right? I'm switching over to, the next thing I want to look at here, right? But take comics, man. Like if you venerate heroes like Spider-Man, one of my personal favorites, right? Like you can kind of tell a lot about what a person values by the heroes that they call heroes, right? And the best story of them all, the story of Jesus Christ, the story of the truth of Jesus Christ, right? Like, if you value him as a hero, then you have to stand against the things that he stood against, aka sin, wherever it's at, right? And I'm not just, not this one. I want to look at Bob Jones University, right? So I'm not going to read this whole article. Definitely not going to do that. But Bob Jones University, the Bible college in Greenville, South Carolina, did not admit black students until the 1970s. All right, think about that. Now, heck, some of y'all watching this might not be old enough to remember, but some of y'all that watch this, hey, you might be old enough to remember the 70s. I'm not. Like I said, I'm 25. But seriously? A Bible college in Greenville, South Carolina. Like, that's a day trip for me, man. That's a day trip for me. From where I'm at in Mount Holly, North Carolina. Greenville, South Carolina. Did not admit black students into the school until the 1970s. And then, for a 30-year period after that, interracial dating was prohibited. Now the university has announced that its policies were wrong. And I do kind of want to read about what President Jones had to say. For almost 2 centuries, American Christianity, including Bob Jones University in its early stages, was characterized by the segregationist ethos of American culture. Consequently, for far too long, we allowed institutional policies regarding race to be shaped more directly by that ethos than by the principles and precepts of the scriptures. All right, let me sum that up, right? For about 2 centuries, Bob Jones University did not ask the question of whether or not what they were doing matched up with God's definition of good and love and justice, but rather whether it matched up with their own definitions of it. That's what they're saying. And at whatever point President Jones made that statement, he was saying, look, we've looked back on that history and we're declaring that history to be sinful and wrong, and we are proclaiming our commitment to work towards the definitions of good and love and justice as espoused by God through Jesus in the scriptures. Right? Like, that's what that's saying, man. We conformed to the culture rather than provide a clear Christian counterpoint to it. Romans chapter 12, right? Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. They're saying that we failed to do that. And there were true societal consequences for their failure to do that, right? Like, no black students were admitted to the college until the 1970s. It didn't have to be that way. Had they allowed themselves to be transformed by the renewal of their minds, the story of Bob Jones U could have been a lot better of a story than this one. And I'm not saying that I'm like I'm glad about the statement that they made, I'm just saying, if we're going to say things like, make America great again, then what the statement implies is that there was a previous golden age of America where it was pretty much fine for everybody, or most everybody. And I reject that notion based on the definitions of good, love, and justice that God gives us through Jesus. I simply look back at American history and I ask the question, is that what American culture was trying to do? Is that what they were doing at the time? I gotta answer no. All right? And I mean, he knows it. Like, in so doing, we failed to accurately represent the Lord and to fulfill the commandment to love others as ourselves. For these failures, we are profoundly sorry. Though no antagonism towards minorities or expressions of racism on a personal level have ever been tolerated on our campus, we allowed institutional policies to remain in place that were racially hurtful. And keep in mind, for a 30-year period, I could have sworn that was still up there. I guess not. For a 30-year period, interracial dating was prohibited. It was prohibited. And I'm trying to... Oh, there it is. Look at this. Look at this. I don't know how well... I think you guys might be able to see that well. That picture on the wall, right? That's that good-looking guy in the blue shirt. That's me. A beautiful lady to the left there. That's... or right, depending on how it looks on your screen. That's my wife. That's our wedding day. And the dude behind us, that's our Pastor Charlie that was marrying us that day, right? Like, think about that. Look at that picture, and then think about the fact that for a 30-year period, at a so-called Christian university, that union that you're looking at on your screen in the little box down there would not have been allowed. Would not have been allowed. And for no biblical basis. For no biblical basis whatsoever. That's not cool, man. Should I really look back on those days and say, I want to bring America back to those days? I don't think so. And then lastly, because, I mean, it's not like black people are the only people that matter, I wanted to look at the Japanese internment, or at least mention it, right? Like, became a Christian in Japan, got a huge love for the culture, for the place. But, I mean, think about that. Think about what happened here, right? President Roosevelt declared that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a date which will live in infamy. Which is true. But the attack on Pearl Harbor also launched a rash of fear about national security, especially on the West Coast. Right? 2 months after the attack, 2 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Executive Order 9066 was issued, which resulted in the internment of Japanese Americans. All right, like that's not cool, man. Look at some of these pictures. Western Defense Command and 4th Army Wartime Civil Control Administration. April 1st, 1942. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following areas. Right? I mean, I can't see absolutely everything here, but I mean, it's not saying good stuff. It's not saying good stuff at all. Should we look back on this time and say, we want to... Do we even want to imply that we're trying to return America to this golden age? Right? If you want to call it a golden age. I would hope not. But just some background information, right? Prior to the outbreak of World War II, the FBI had identified German, Italian, and Japanese aliens who were suspected of being potential enemy agents, and they were kept under surveillance, right? Following the Pearl Harbor attack, suspicion rose not only for aliens who came from enemy nations, but around all persons of Japanese descent, whether Issei, foreign-born, or Nisei, born on American soil. And during this sentence is very interesting to me. During congressional committee hearings, representatives of the DOJ raised logistical, constitutional, and ethical objections, but regardless, the task was turned over to the U.S. Army as a security matter. Doesn't this just sound like human nature, right? Like, we know that what we're doing is really sus. We know that what we're doing is really sus, and our conscience tells us it's jacked up, and if we have any Christian education at all that's worth its weight in gold, then we know that this doesn't really accord with justice or good or love. But we'll use a term like security matter to just kind of brush the whole thing over. Is that really good? I mean, I don't think so, man. Like, I mean, you've got the link for the article right here if you want to read about it more, or you can just, I guess, pause the video as I'm scrolling and read it. I'm just gonna quote Justice Murphy of the Supreme Court. He said, I join in the opinion of the court, but I'm of the view that detention and relocation centers of persons of Japanese ancestry, regardless of loyalty, is not only unauthorized by Congress or the executive, but is another example of the unconstitutional resort to racism inherent in the entire evacuation program. Now, this is a guy who lived through this, right? All I can do is read the history books, but he lived in the culture of the time. And what does he call this? He calls this, quote, another example. Another example. Not like the first example, but another one on a list of examples of unconstitutional resorts to racism inherent in the entire evacuation program. As stated more fully in my dissenting opinion in Fred Toyosaburo Korematsu versus United States, or Korematsu versus United States, racial discrimination of this nature bears no reasonable relation to military necessity and is utterly foreign to the ideals and traditions of the American people. All right. Now, I don't know if I would say it's utterly foreign to the ideals and traditions of the American people, but hey, you had a strong conscience standing up at the time saying you shouldn't do this. In 1988, President Reagan signed, something that provided a $20,000 cash payment to each person who was interned. And one of the most stunning ironies in this episode of American Civil Liberties was articulated by an internee who, when told that the Japanese were put in those camps for their own protection, that was a lie, we're putting you in cages for your own protection, countered with this amazing quote, if we were put there for our protection, why were the guns at the guard towers pointed inward instead of outward? Done with the board. Now, these trips down memory lane are not always the most fun. I truly grant that. But they are necessary, right? Because it's only against the backdrop of, our sinful past that we really have a context to understand the beauty of the gospel, the beauty of the gift of grace given to us, in Christ. And have I ever missed my days living in Japan? Yes, absolutely, I've missed them. They're a big part of who I am. It still reflects even in a big way in how I live my life today, how me and my wife live our lives and live out our Christianity today. And do I sometimes catch myself daydreaming and asking that question, that ecclesiastical question? Man, where'd those good times go? Where were those good days? Yeah, I do sometimes catch myself saying that, but let me tell you what it is that this one here is missing whenever I allow myself to wander down that road. Let me tell you some of the things that I'm by looking at those former days, outside of the lens of God. I'm taking my eyes off Ephesians chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. The revealed mystery of God's will, God's plan for the universe, for all of time, it says, is to unite all things in Jesus Christ, things in heaven and things on earth. I'm taking my eyes off that plan, right? Because the fulfillment of that plan lies in the future, not in my past. So when I'm idolizing my version of events, I'm no longer hoping in a better country, as it says in Hebrews. I'm no longer hoping in a better place, a better time, a place and time where Jesus Christ and his glories are known throughout the world, where this salvation of mine is fully completed and my free will is fully liberated to be used to glorify my King and love my neighbor as myself in the kingdom. I'm not looking at that hope. I'm not looking at that hope anymore. I'm not looking at not even just like the future stuff, like the future fulfillment of the kingdom. I'm not even looking at God's plans for today to unify the body. When we focus on, man, maybe we can make America great again. Maybe I can make my life great again. Not maybe I can make my life great by following Jesus Christ from this point forward, but maybe I can make my life great by reaching backwards into a sinful past and trying to replicate it. Right? Like when that's what I'm doing, I'm taking my eyes off God's intention to make a strong, beautiful Christian community that is living life in her Messiah in a dark world. Like, I'm missing out on that. I'm missing out on doing my part to build that. Right? Because we all have a part to play. Christian, we all have a part to play in realizing the fullest expression of Jesus's kingdom in this earth. We've all got a part to play. And if all of us are busy daydreaming about past scenarios that weren't even that great, then we're just going to keep reliving our past. We're just going to keep revisiting our past over and over and over again, instead of realizing the kingdom realities that we can realize by the power of the Spirit in love in our Christian communities. Right? And I know the word for that is church, but I'm choosing to use the phrase Christian communities. Right? When is the last time you really committed yourself saying and praying to God, Lord, help me not focus on how my old life as a slave used to be. Help me focus on building a new life in you as a freed man with all these other freed brothers and sisters that you've brought along. Help me focus on that. Help me take off these nostalgic glasses, these foolish nostalgic glasses, and focus on your kingdom. And focus on the joy of your kingdom. Right? That's the sort of thing that the Christianity of the land can't focus on. In Christian conservatism's pursuit to build a righteous nation in America, they miss the fact that they've already been grafted in to a righteous nation, the kingdom of Jesus Christ. If it's a righteous nation you want, you're already a citizen of heaven. You're just waiting for your king to come down. You're waiting for your king to come down and fully flesh it out in this world, but you're already part of a righteous nation. Stop feeling the need. Stop feeling the need to make an American Christian identity. Stop feeling the need to try to make a Christian American identity, and just live in the freedom of Jesus giving you a Christian identity. Sit at the feet of Jesus. Learn all that that entails. Learn the freedom of the kingdom, and invite anyone. Invite anyone and everyone that'll listen in. Listen and invite everyone that'll listen in. Focus on building true communities of Jesus and other-centered love. True multi-ethnic, multi-background, just, diverse communities of God-fearing, other-centered love. And you don't need the permission of America to get started with that. You've already got the green light given as the command from Jesus Christ to build it, saints. So get building. Get building. Open your homes. Open your homes up to your neighbors. Open your homes up to, the neighborhood, right? Like, you're planted on mission in the communities that you're at. Bring them in, man. Bring them in. How about instead of inviting people to church, how about you invite them over for dinner? How about you invite them over for dinner? Invite them over for lunch. Or, offer to, go to their place and make dinner. Have a kingdom feast with those people. Put the kingdom on display for them to see. Just love them. Just love them. And tell them about a good, righteous, and holy God that gave up everything, that gave up his life to see them live in him, gave up his life to give us the opportunity to give up our slave life of sin and find life in our Creator. Like, isn't that a better use of your time and mental energies than reliving former days that weren't even that good? I think so. So, yeah, I just need to get that meditation off my chest, and I definitely need to hurry up and get to sleep, because I got respiratory therapy class in the morning. Gigantic notebook filled to the brim. Pharmacology is going good. That class is going legit right now. And I know this isn't really part of the topic. I'm just kind of sharing it with you. Yep. Classes are going good. Classes are going good. I'm making electrolyte flashcards. Trying to remember the electrolytes. But yeah, I'm just terrible at ending anything. Go check out some of the other content on the channel. I plan to record a new Living Martyrs video with my wife when she gets her energy levels up and rested. We'll be doing our episode on that. Yeah, man, like, chew on it, man. Just chew on it, Stop looking back. Stop looking back through a sinful lens, through a foolish lens. Look forward. Look forward in the light of Christ. And pray that the Spirit of God will help you build a better today and a better tomorrow for the kingdom in you and for the kingdom around you. All right? That's a good use of our time, saints. Peace.